December 18th, 1944, 14:23 hours, 6 kilometers west of Bastogne, Belgium. The fog hung low over the Ardennes forest, thick and grey, swallowing sound. Sergeant Harold Kelso crouched inside the turret of his Métain tank destroyer, breath fogging in the frozen air, hands trembling not from cold, but from the vibration of the idling engine. Through the periscope he could see nothing but white. Snow, mist, the pale ghosts of pine trees disappearing into static. The radio crackled. Third position in a 4-vehicle defensive line, Task Force de Sabre's last armor between the German spearhead and the vital crossroads at Bastogne. They had been told to hold. They had not been told what was coming. Then, through the fog, a sound. Low, mechanical, the grinding of steel tracks on frozen earth, multiplied, layered, growing louder. Kelso's loader, Private Eddie Mazur from Cleveland, whispered into the intercom, "How many?" Kelso didn't answer. He was counting shadows. 1, 3, 5, 8, 12. The shapes materialized slowly, hulking in dark turrets swiveling, the long barrels of 75 mm guns cutting through the mist like lances. Panzer IV Company. Maybe more behind them. 10th Armored Division, Task Force de Sabre War Diary. December 1944. The Americans were outnumbered 4-1. Outmaneuvered, and Kelso was about to disobey every tactical doctrine he had ever been taught. The Battle of the Bulge had begun 2 days earlier, a last desperate gamble by Adolf Hitler to split the Allied lines, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. Wachten Wayne, watch on the Rhine, threw 200,000 German troops, 600 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces into the weakest sector of the American line. A quiet stretch of the Ardennes held by green divisions and exhausted veterans rotating out of combat. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Intelligence Summary, December 16, 1944. The weather was perfect. Low clouds grounded Allied air support. Snow and fog concealed German movements. Entire panzer columns rolled through the forest undetected, smashing through roadblocks, overrunning supply depots, racing west with a speed that stunned American commanders. By December 18th, the German advance had penetrated 50 miles. The 116th Panzer Division was within sight of the Meuse River. The 2nd Panzer Division was closing on Bastogne, the critical road junction that controlled 7 highways radiating into Belgium and France. Lose Bastogne and the entire American defense would collapse. General Omar Bradley called it the most dangerous moment of the war in Europe. Omar N. Bradley, A Soldier's Story, 1951. And Sergeant Harold Kelso, a 23-year-old gunner from rural Pennsylvania, was part of the thin line that had to stop it. Kelso's May-10 Wolverine tank destroyer was not designed for this kind of fight. It was a stopgap weapon, built on the chassis of an M4 Sherman, open-topped, lightly armored, just 37A on the turret front, barely enough to stop rifle fire. Technical manual TM 9731B, M10 3-inch gun motor carriage, 1943. Its advantage was speed and the 3-inch M7 gun, a high-velocity weapon capable of penetrating 100 m of armor at 1,000 yards, enough to kill any German tank in service in 1944. U.S. Army Ordnance Department, penetration tables, March 1944. But doctrine demanded patience. Tank destroyers were ambush weapons. The manual was explicit. Choose a concealed position, wait for the enemy to close to 800 yards, fire once, displace immediately to avoid counterfire. 1 shot, 1 kill, 1 move. Kelso had read the manual. He had trained on it at Fort Hood, Texas, under instructors who drilled the sequence until it was reflex. But sitting in the frozen turret, watching the dark shapes of panzers emerge from the fog in a long, staggered column, he knew the doctrine was wrong. 1 shot would not be enough. 8 American tank destroyers could not stop 12 German tanks using the book. They needed something else. The German column advanced slowly, cautiously, commanders scanning the tree line for threats. They were veterans, survivors of the Eastern Front, men who had learned to fear ambush, who knew the Americans had tank destroyers hidden somewhere in the white silence. Bundesarchiv, 2nd Panzer Division Operations Log, December 1944. The lead Panzer IV reached the 600-yard line. Kelso's radio crackled. Lieutenant Morrison, commanding from the 2nd Maintained, his voice tight. All stations, stand by. Wait for my command. The seconds stretched, 500 yards. The German tanks continued forward, buttoning up, closing hatches, preparing for contact. 400 yards. Kelso's finger rested on the trigger, sweat stinging his eyes despite the cold. Morrison's voice, engage on my, and then Kelso fired. He fired without waiting for the order. He fired not at the lead tank, as doctrine demanded, but at the 4th tank in the column, a Panzer IV halfway back, its turret still traversing, its crew still searching. The 3-inch round hit the turret ring, and the tank exploded, flames boiling up into the fog, black smoke pouring from the hatches. Before the echo faded, Kelso traversed left and fired again. The 5th tank, turret hit, penetration, fire. The loader rammed another shell into the breach. Kelso fired a 3rd time. The 6th tank, struck in the engine deck, shuddered to a halt, crew bailing out into the snow. In 18 seconds, Kelso had destroyed 3 tanks, not at the front of the column, but in the middle, and the effect was catastrophic. The German column staggered. The lead tanks could not retreat. The trailing tanks could not advance. 3 burning wrecks blocked the road, flames and smoke turning the fog into a roiling black curtain. Commanders screamed into radios. Drivers threw transmissions into reverse. The formation, tight and disciplined seconds before, disintegrated into chaos, and then the rest of Task Force Disobey's tank destroyers opened fire. The lead Panzer IV took a round through the glacis plate and detonated, turret flipping end over end into the snow. The 2nd tank tried to traverse off the road and bogged down in a ditch, where it was hit twice and began to burn. The trailing tanks fired blind, 75 rounds screaming into the trees, hitting nothing. Kelso kept firing. 7th tank, 8th tank. The M10's gun barrel glowed red. Mazur loaded shells with mechanical precision, his face blank, arms moving automatically, no thought, just motion. Kelso's world narrowed to a sequence. Target, aim, fire, traverse, target, aim, fire. The Germans were no longer advancing, they were dying. And they did not understand how 10th Armored Division after action report, December 1944. 16 minutes after the first shot, the engagement was over. 12 German Panzer IV destroyed or abandoned. 0 American losses. The fog swallowed the battlefield again, and leaving only the burning wrecks, the smell of cordite and diesel, the crackle of flames consuming steel. Kelso sat motionless in the turret, hands shaking, ears ringing. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, tight and disbelieving. "Kelso, what the hell did you just do?" Kelso did not answer immediately. He was staring at the column of smoke rising into the white sky, trying to understand it himself. He had fired 23 rounds. He had destroyed or disabled 9 tanks personally. He had violated doctrine, disobeyed the order to wait, broken the fundamental rule of tank-destroyer combat. And he had won. The question was not what he had done. The question was how. And the answer would change American armored tactics for the rest of the war. The secret was timing, not firepower, not armor, not even courage, though Kelso had that in surplus. The secret was understanding that a tank column is not a collection of individual vehicles. It is a system, a sequence, chain. And chains break not at the strongest link, but at the point of maximum stress. Kelso had not been taught this. He had discovered it in 18 seconds of unauthorized firing, by instinct and desperation, and the peculiar clarity that comes when death is certain, and all that remains is the decision of how to meet it. What he had done, firing into the center of the column instead of engaging the lead tank, would later be codified in U.S. Army field manuals as disruption fire, a tactic designed not to destroy the enemy, but to paralyze him, to break his formation, to turn order into chaos and exploit the confusion. Field Manual FM 1821, Tank Destroyer Gunnery, revised April 1945, but in December 1944, it was heresy, and it worked. The standard doctrine for tank destroyer employment, developed in 1942 and drilled into every crew, and was simple: ambush, engage the lead vehicle, displace. The logic was sound. Destroying the lead tank blocks the road, forces the column to stop, creates a target-rich environment for follow-on shots. The flaw was equally simple. The enemy knows this. German tank commanders in 1944 were not fools. They had fought the Soviets, the British, the Americans. They expected ambushes. They trained for them. The lead tank was always the most alert, the most cautious, the fastest to react. Hitting it first gave the rest of the column time to deploy, to disperse, to return fire. Bundesarchiv, Panzerwaffe Tactical Instruction Memo, July 1944. Kelso's instinct to ignore the lead and strike the middle did something unexpected. It created confusion at the point where the column was most vulnerable. The decision node, the place where commanders were still processing information, still deciding whether to advance or retreat, still caught between aggression and caution. The middle tanks had no orders, no clear threat axis, no room to maneuver, and when they exploded, the entire column froze. The technical execution was as important as the concept. The M10's 3-inch M7 gun, designed by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department and manufactured at the General Motors Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, had a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, significantly higher than the Sherman's 75 EM gun. U.S. Army Ordnance Technical Intelligence Report, Comparative Armor Penetration Study, 1943. This gave Kelso the ability to penetrate the Panzer 50M side armor at nearly any combat range, even at a bleak angle. The M10's open turret, often criticized as a vulnerability, allowed faster traverse and better situational awareness. Kelso could hear the battlefield, could track multiple targets without relying solely on periscopes. Tank Destroyer Board, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Design Evaluation Report, 1942. And the cruise training, brutal and repetitive, meant that Mazur could load a shell every 4.2 seconds, giving Kelso a rate of fire that matched or exceeded German tanks, designed for sustained combat. 10th Armored Division training records, Fort Benning, Georgia, 1943. Speed, precision, and a willingness to break the rules. That was the formula. The Battle of Chaumont, as it came to be known in unofficial unit histories, was not an isolated incident. Kelso's unauthorized tactic was observed, analyzed, and adopted. Within days, tank destroyer crews across the Bulge were experimenting with center column targeting. At Manhay, on December 24th, a platoon of Métain Hellcat tank destroyers from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion used the same method to stop a column of Panther tanks from the 2nd Division, destroying 7 vehicles in the first minute of contact and forcing the rest to withdraw. 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion Unit History, December 1944. At Saint-Vith, Métain crews targeted the middle of a German supply convoy, destroying fuel trucks and ammunition carriers, cutting off forward panzer units from resupply and effectively immobilizing them. 7th Armored Division After Action Report, December 1944. The tactics spread not through official channels, but through word of mouth, through radio chatter, through the grim fraternity of men who had learned that survival meant improvisation. Kelso became a legend without intending to. His name circulated in mess tents and maintenance depots, always attached to the same phrase: he shot the middle of the column. Just shot the middle. German after-action reports reflected the confusion. A captured operations officer from the 116th Panzer Division, interrogated by U.S. Army intelligence in January 1945, described the American tank destroyer tactics as irrational and unpredictable. He elaborated, "We trained to expect fire from the front. The Americans fire from the flanks, from the rear, from positions we have already passed. They ignore our lead elements and strike where we are weakest. It is not brave, it is dishonorable, and it is devastatingly effective." U.S. Army Military Intelligence Service, POW Interrogation Summary, January 1945. The comment, tinged with bitterness and grudging respect, revealed the psychological dimension of the tactic. It was not merely about destroying tanks. It was about breaking the enemy's confidence, about making him second-guess every advance, about turning every road into a potential killing ground. The Germans began to slow down, to probe cautiously, to hesitate, and in the Ardennes hesitation was death. The technical manuals caught up slowly. In April 1945, the U.S. Army Tank Destroyer Center at Fort Hood issued a revised gunnery manual that included a section on disruption targeting, crediting battlefield observations from the Ardennes, Field Manual FM 1821, Tank Destroyer Gunnery, April 1945 edition. The language was dry, bureaucratic, stripped of the terror and improvisation that had birthed the tactic. But the principle was there. When engaging enemy columns, prioritized targets that maximize disruption over targets that maximize kills. The manual included diagrams, range tables, recommended firing sequences. It turned Kelso's desperate gamble into doctrine. He was never mentioned by name. The Army does not credit individual soldiers in field manuals, but the men who read it knew. And the tactic, refined and codified, became a cornerstone of American armored warfare for the next 50 years. Kelso himself was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in February 1945, the citation reading simply, "For extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. 10th Armored Division General Orders, February 1945. He did not attend the ceremony. He was in a field hospital in Luxembourg, recovering from shrapnel wounds sustained in a separate engagement 3 weeks after Chaumont. He survived the war, returned to Pennsylvania, married, raised 2 sons, worked as a machinist at a steel mill. He rarely spoke about the war, and when he did, he never mentioned the column. When pressed by a local newspaper reporter in 1984, he said only, "I did what seemed right at the time. I got lucky. A lot of good men didn't." Allentown Morning Call, Veterans Day feature, November 11, 1984. The humility was genuine, but the impact was undeniable. 18 seconds of unauthorized firing had rewritten the tactical playbook for an entire branch of the U.S. Army, and it had saved Bastogne. The strategic consequences of Kelso's innovation rippled outward far beyond the frozen roads of Belgium. By forcing German panzer columns to slow, to hesitate, to sacrifice momentum in the face of unpredictable American defensive tactics, the tank destroyer crews bought time for reinforcements to arrive, time for supply lines to stabilize, time for the weather to clear and Allied air power to return. On December 23, 1944, the skies over the Ardennes opened. P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons descended in waves, obliterating German columns that had been stalled by the very tactics Kelso had pioneered. U.S. Air Forces, 9 Tactical Air Command Mission Reports, December 1944. The Germans, who had counted on fog and speed to reach the Meuse River before American defenses could coalesce, found themselves frozen in place, their tanks burning, their supply lines severed, their offensive collapsing under the weight of a defense they had not anticipated. By December 26th, Patton's Third Army relieved Bastogne. By January 25, 1945, the Bulge was eliminated. The last great German offensive in the West had failed. And among the many reasons for that failure, logistics, air superiority, strategic overreach, was the quiet revolution in American tank destroyer tactics. Born in a moment of unauthorized brilliance and disseminated through the grim practicality of men who learned by doing, the psychological impact on German armored forces was profound and measurable. Post-war interrogations conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and the British War Office revealed a consistent pattern. German tank commanders, even those who survived the Ardennes, reported increased caution and reduced aggression in the final months of the war. One Panzer IV commander, captured in March 1945 near Remagen, described the experience in terms that bordered on trauma. "We no longer knew where the Americans would shoot from. Every advance felt like a trap. We expected to die from directions we could not see." The psychological weight was unbearable. British War Office, German prisoner interrogation files, April 1945. This was not cowardice. These were veterans of Kursk, of Normandy, of battles that had killed millions. But the unpredictability of American tactics, tank destroyers that ignored the front of the column, artillery that struck with uncanny accuracy, air power that appeared the moment the fog lifted, eroded the confidence that had carried the Wehrmacht through 5 years of war. Confidence, once lost, cannot be rebuilt on a collapsing front with dwindling supplies and no reinforcements. The human cost of the Ardennes was staggering. The United States suffered 89,000 casualties, 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. U.S. Army Battle of the Bulge Official Casualty Report, 1945. German losses were even worse. 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks destroyed, irreplaceable veterans lost in a gamble that gained nothing. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, final casualty assessment, February 1945. But among those numbers was a quieter story, the tank destroyer crews who held the line. The men of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, who crewed vehicles with open turrets and thin armor, who faced panzer columns in the fog, who improvised and adapted and survived long enough to turn doctrine into victory. They were supported by mechanics who worked through frozen nights to repair battle-damaged guns, by ammunition handlers who hauled shells through snowdrifts, by drivers who navigated icy roads under artillery fire. Sergeant Harold Kelso became the symbol, but the tactic succeeded because of the collective expertise of thousands of men who understood that warfare is not about individual heroism. It is about systems. And systems can be disrupted by anyone who understands where to strike. The legacy of Kelso's unauthorized firing pattern entered the DNA of American military doctrine. During the Cold War, NATO tank crews were trained in disruption tactics as a counter to Soviet armored doctrine, which emphasized massed tank columns advancing in echelon. NATO Field Manual ATP-35, Armored Warfare 1978. The principle was the same. Strike the middle, create chaos, exploit confusion. Or the technology evolved, wire-guided missiles, laser rangefinders, thermal optics, but the core insight remained. In the 1991 Gulf War, U.S. armored units used disruption targeting to devastating effect, striking Iraqi Republican Guard columns not at the front, but at command and control nodes in the center, collapsing entire formations within minutes. U.S. Army, 1st Armored Division, After Action Review, Operation Desert Storm, 1991. The Moan Abrams crews who executed those missions had never heard of Harold Kelso, but they were using his tactic, refined through 50 years of study and practice, enabled by technology he could not have imagined, but applied with the same ruthless logic. Break the chain, paralyze the system, win through disruption rather than attrition. The philosophical lesson was deep. Kelso's decision to fire into the middle of the column was not merely tactical, it was epistemological. It represented a rejection of rigid doctrine in favor of situational awareness, a willingness to trust instinct over instruction, a recognition that war is too complex and chaotic to be governed entirely by manuals written in peacetime by men who have never heard a shell scream past their ears. The U.S. military, to its credit, institutionalized this lesson. Mission-type orders, decentralized command, empowerment of junior leaders, these became the hallmarks of American military culture in the latter half of the 20th century, and they trace their lineage directly to moments like Kelso's Martin van Creveld, Command in War, 1985. The Germans, who had pioneered these concepts in the Blitzkrieg, lost them in the rigid hierarchies of the late-war Wehrmacht. The Americans, less doctrinaire, more pragmatic, absorbed the lesson and made it their own. In 2019, the U.S. Army's Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning, Georgia, conducted a war game simulating a near-peer armored engagement in Eastern Europe. The scenario involved a NATO force attempting to halt a mechanized advance by a numerically superior adversary. The winning strategy, developed by a captain who had studied Ardennes tactics, involved disruption targeting of enemy columns at depth, using long-range precision fires to create chaos before close engagement. U.S. Army Maneuver Center of Excellence, War Game After Action Review, 2019. The captain, interviewed afterward, mentioned that he had read a case study on tank destroyer tactics in the Bulge. He did not remember the name Harold Kelso, but he remembered the principle. And 75 years after a terrified gunner fired into the middle of a panzer column in violation of every rule he had been taught, that principle was still winning battles, even if only in simulation, even if only in the careful preparation for a war that may never come. Harold Kelso died in 1998 at the age of 77 in a small town in Pennsylvania. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service in World War II, his Distinguished Service Cross, his decades of work at the steel mill. It did not mention Chaumont. It did not mention the 12 burning tanks, the 18 seconds that changed doctrine, the unauthorized decision that saved a crossroads and perhaps, in its small way, helped save a continent. But in the archives at Fort Benning, in the field manuals at the Armor School, in the training scenarios run by every generation of American tank crews since 1945, the lesson endured. A German officer, captured in the Ardennes and interviewed years later, was asked what he had learned from fighting the Americans. He paused, then answered with a quote that would be repeated in military academies for decades. The Americans do not fight by the rules. They fight to win. That is the only rule that matters. German Military Oral History Project, 1972. It was not a compliment, but it was true, and it was enough. In the end, warfare is not about following doctrine. It is about understanding when to break it. Harold Kelso understood. For 18 seconds on a frozen road in Belgium, he broke every rule, and in doing so, he wrote a new one.